Okay, so here's a question maybe you haven't really stopped to ask yourself. What if the definition of alive, like the actual definition, is fundamentally a political thing?
Yeah, what if the biological facts of our existence are actually, shaped by how power operates?
Exactly. It's a pretty wild thought.
And that's precisely the territory we're exploring today. We're doing a deep dive into Giorgio Agamben's big work, Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life. It's dense, but fascinating.
Right. And our goal here isn't just to, rehash academic theory. We want to pull out the really surprising stuff, the insights into how states actually define life.
And how they control it, even exclude it, sometimes in the very act of governing.
Yeah, and you listening might have some real aha moments connecting these like ancient legal ideas to your own life today. It's surprisingly relevant.
It really is. And we're starting with this paradox. Agamben picks up from Foucault. For ages, humans were seen as basically living animals plus politics.
Like politics was an add-on.
Right. But Foucault noticed a shift in modern times. We've become an animal whose politics actually puts its biological existence, its life, into question.
Okay, that's a big claim. Let's unpack that. And the core seems to be this figure from way back in Roman law, Homo Sacer. It sounds almost mythical.
It really does.
Yeah.
The way Agamben presents it, drawing from this old source, Pompeius Festus. Well, imagine this. Homo Sacer is someone judged for a crime. Simple enough, right?
Okay.
But here's the twist. You are not allowed to sacrifice this person to the gods. It's forbidden.
Huh. So not a religious sacrifice.
But at the same time, anyone can kill him. And if they do, they won't be charged with homicide.
Wait, what? Not sacrificable, but killable without consequence. How does that even fit into any legal box?
It doesn't. That's the point. He's caught in what Agamben calls a double exception. Excluded from human law because killing him isn't murder.
Yeah.
And excluded from divine law because he can't be sacrificed.
Sure, he's just outside.
Yeah.
But defined by being outside both.
Exactly. His life exists outside both human and divine law, but it's fundamentally linked to both through that very exclusion. The law puts him there.
And Agamben calls this sacred life or bare life. But just to be clear, this isn't sacred in the usual religious sense, right?
No, not at all. It's a political term here. It's life that cannot be sacrificed ritually, yet can be killed by anyone. Agamben argues this reveals something really fundamental, an originary political structure that exists even before we separate sacred and profane.
Okay, so why does this ancient, frankly bizarre legal figure matter to us, to you listening?
Because this bare life, this life stripped down to its biological essence but caught in this legal paradox, is the hidden key, Agamben says, to understanding sovereign power itself. It's the life that power can ultimately act upon.
Right, the raw material power works on. So how does that connect to sovereignty as we maybe understand it today?
Well, here we need to bring in Carl Schmitt. His definition of sovereignty is super influential, and Agamben uses it. Schmitt says, sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception.
The state of exception, like a state of emergency.
Sort of, but it's more fundamental. It's the power to suspend the normal rule of law. And Schmitt points out this paradox. The sovereign, in making that decision, stands both outside the law, because they're suspending it, and inside it, because they have the legal right to suspend it.
Okay, that's a bit mind-bending. So they're above the law, but legally.
Precisely. They have the legal power to say the law doesn't apply right now, legally placing themselves outside its normal operation.
And this state of exception, it's not just total chaos then?
No, that's crucial. It's not anarchy. It's a specific situation created by the suspension of the rule. The law is still related to the exception, Agamben says, because it applies by no longer applying, by withdrawing from it.
It defines itself by what it chooses not to cover in that moment.
Exactly. And this structure is what he calls inclusive exclusion. Something is included within the system purely by virtue of being marked as excluded from its normal rules. Think of it like setting something apart to show what the rule is.
Okay, maybe an example helps here. Agamben talks about example versus exception.
Right. They form a kind of system. An example is what he calls an exclusive inclusion. It belongs to the set, but it's shown by temporarily taking it out to represent the whole, like showing one specific grammatical sentence to illustrate a general rule.
Okay, that makes sense. You exclude it momentarily to include the idea.
But the exception is the inclusive exclusion. It's brought into the system precisely because it doesn't fit the rule. It defines the limit.
And these can blur. Like the shibboleth example, that one's pretty grim.
Yeah, from the Book of Judges. Basically, it was a password. The Ephraimites couldn't pronounce the she sound. They said sibboleth.
Just a slight difference in speech, an example of dialect, really.
But it became the exception that determined life or death. If you said it wrong, you were killed on the spot. That linguistic example became the absolute exception separating us from them, life from death.
Wow. So a tiny detail becomes the basis for exclusion with lethal consequences.
It shows how the law doesn't just command things. First, it creates the very sphere where it applies. It carves out its territory in reality. And the rule lives off the exception alone. It gets its power, its definition, from what it manages to capture and exclude.
That's quite a different way to think about law. Not just rules, but this constant defining through exclusion.
And that leads to another figure. Agamben explores the figure of the person under the ban in Old Germanic law. Friedlosigkeit.
Which means?
Literally peacelessness or friendlessness. The banned person was abandoned by the law, like the wargus, the wolfman or werewolf figure.
A werewolf, seriously?
Well, as a legal concept, yes. This figure is neither fully inside nor fully outside the law. They exist on a threshold of indistinction, Agamben says, between animal and man, nature, physis, and law, nomos, exclusion, and inclusion.
Like in those old stories.
Exactly. Like the lay of Bisclafret he mentions. The Baron becomes a wolf when he takes off his human clothes, losing his human status. He can only return by getting those clothes back through a formal process, often involving the king, the sovereign. He's in this suspended state.
So this state of exception, the ban, the wolfman, Agamben's point is that this isn't just ancient history or myth.
Not at all. He argues this structure of exception is fundamental, maybe even the fundamental structure of how power operates, constantly defining who's in, who's out, whose life is protected by law, and whose isn't, or is only partially.
And this wolfman becomes a metaphor for people today pushed to the margins, existing in that blurry zone, outside normal protection, but still subject to power.
Precisely. It's a life held in suspension, defined by its relationship to that sovereign power that can include or exclude.
Okay, so let's connect this to modernity. Foucault talked about biopolitics. How does that link up with Homo Sacer and the exception?
Well, Foucault saw a major shift happening around the threshold of the modern era. Suddenly, natural life itself, Zoe, just biological existence, starts getting directly included in the calculations and mechanisms of state power. Politics becomes biopolitics.
A big change from, say, Aristotle, who distinguished just living to zone from living the good life in the city to euzone.
Exactly. For Aristotle, politics was about the quality of life, the euzone. But in modernity, the state becomes concerned with managing life itself, birth rates, health, longevity, the population as a biological entity. That basic Zoe enters the political stage.
So the state starts managing life directly, and this even relates back to concepts like the king's two bodies.
Agamben reads it that way, slightly differently than Kantorowicz. He links it more to Roman ideas of the emperor becoming divine. The king's political body isn't just about continuity. It also embodies this kind of excess of sacred life, something absolute, almost inhuman about sovereignty itself.
Which is why killing a king wasn't just murder.
Right. It was crimen levae majestatis, a crime against majesty. Almost like the sovereign's life itself is unsacrificable in a way, existing in a different legal sphere. You can think about Louis VI's trial. It wasn't a standard criminal trial, or even maybe things like impeachment processes today. They operate outside the normal judicial system.
Okay, that's fascinating. But if life becomes so central to politics, what happens to things like the rights of man? Hannah Arendt had that observation about refugees.
Yeah, Arendt's point is crucial. She noticed that the inalienable rights of man seemed to break down precisely when the refugee appeared. The person who was nothing but human, stripped of citizenship, nationality, everything else.
Why would human rights fail the purely human? It seems backwards.
Agamben's take is that these declarations of rights aren't some universal value floating above law. They represent the moment that natural life itself gets inscribed into the order of the nation-state. Birth nativity becomes the foundation.
So you have rights because you're born into a specific state.
Essentially, yes. Rights are given to man only because he's the presupposed foundation for the citizen. When you lose citizenship, like a refugee, you fall back into that bare life state, and the rights often evaporate because they were tied to that national political structure all along.
Which leads us, maybe inevitably, to Nazism as a kind of ultimate horrific form of biopolitics.
It's a stark example. Agamben connects the Nazi slogan, blood and soil, Blut und Boden, directly back to those old Roman legal ideas. Vicus soli, right as soil, where you're born, and aequus sanguinis, right of blood, who your parents are.
Just basic citizenship criteria, usually.
But Nazism twisted these into the supreme political task, defining who was truly German based on blood and territory, and crucially, who was not. This defined who was considered full life and who was, chillingly, life unworthy of being lived.
A life reduced to bare life, to be eliminated.
It was the state deciding on the biological value or non-value of life itself.
And Agamben argues that when bare life becomes the central political object, the old distinctions, right versus left, liberal versus totalitarian, they start to blur.
Yeah, they enter what he calls a zone of indistinction. Think about the 20th century, how rapidly some democracies collapsed into totalitarian states, and sometimes back again. He suggests that beneath the surface ideologies, the underlying logic of managing life biopolitics can operate across different systems.
And the role of experts, like doctors and scientists, changes too.
Definitely. There's an increasing symbiosis, Agamben says, between the sovereign power and the experts who can categorize, measure, and manage life.
Like the Nazi euthanasia programs.
A terrifying example where biopolitics explicitly becomes the natopolitics, the politics of deciding who dies. Doctors were empowered to determine the value or non-value of life.
And this isn't just historical. Modern technology creates new versions of this.
He argues it does. Think about modern medicine. Concepts like coma de passe over coma, or the idea of neo-morts. These are bodies legally dead, but kept functioning by machines.
Biologically alive in some sense, but legally not.
It's a state of purely bare life, Agamben says, entirely controlled by man and his technology. He sees it as a modern version of Homo Sacer, a life that can be killed by switching off machines without it being homicide, because legally it's already a corpse, yet it's maintained in a state of biological function.
Wow. That's deeply unsettling. Which brings us to the camp, the concentration camp. Agamben makes this huge claim about it.
Yeah, it's maybe his most controversial and well-known argument. He says the camp isn't just a historical accident, a horrible anomaly. It's the hidden matrix in nomos, the fundamental political space of the modern world.
The underlying logic of our political space now, that's a heavy claim. How does he argue that?
He traces its origins.
Yeah.
Camps didn't start with the Nazis, and they didn't come from ordinary law. They arose out of the state of exception, out of martial law, applied to whole groups of civilians. Think of the Spanish in Cuba, the British in the Boer War.
Spaces created outside normal law for specific populations deemed a threat or somehow outside.
Exactly. And then you have things like the Schutzhaft, protective custody. It allowed detention without a crime being committed, just for state security.
Okay.
The really sinister Nazi innovation, Agamben argues, was to take Schutzhaft, detach it from any declared state of emergency, and make it permanent. The exception became the rule.
So they created a permanent zone outside the law.
Yes, a space outside the rules of penal and prison law. He quotes a Gestapo official saying, basically, there was no specific order creating the camps. One day they were there. A legal void made permanent and spatial.
And inside this void,
inside the camp, law isn't just suspended. Fact and law are completely confused. Anything becomes possible because the people inside are reduced entirely to bare life, stripped of all political status, all rights.
So the question isn't just about the awful things that happen there.
Right. The deeper question for Agamben is, how could human beings be so completely deprived of their rights and prerogatives that no act committed against them could appear any longer as a crime? How is that legal and political stripping away possible?
Which connects back to the idea of the people. You mentioned that word has a split meaning.
Yeah, in many languages like Italian popolo, French people, English people too, really it means both the sovereign political body, we the people, and the excluded, the poor, the masses.
The included citizens and the excluded population.
Agamben sees this ambiguity as revealing a fundamental biopolitical fracture right at the heart of Western politics. A constant tension, almost a civil war, between the political people and the bare life of the population that needs managing or excluding.
And this gives a different perspective on the Holocaust.
He suggests the Jews became, for the Nazis, the ultimate symbol of this internal fracture, the symbol of bare life within the people that modernity creates, but then can't tolerate. The final solution was an attempt to eliminate that fracture, to make the German people a single, pure entity.
By eliminating the bare life element they represented. A horrifying attempt to resolve that biopolitical tension through extermination.
And in doing so, paradoxically turning the entire German people into a kind of sacred life consecrated to death in total war.
So the final really chilling takeaway from Agamben about the camp is?
It's that if the core of the camp is this materialization of the state of exception, this space where law withdraws and bare life is exposed, then we find ourselves potentially in the presence of a camp every time such a structure is created.
Regardless of what it's called or exactly what happens there, like detention centers, refugee camps, certain zones.
Any space where law is indefinitely suspended for a group reduced to bare life. That's why he concludes, we are all virtually Homo Sacer today. Our lives are potentially subject to this logic of exception.
Wow. Okay. That is a lot to take in. We've gone from this obscure Roman fugule Homo Sacer
Through the paradoxes of sovereign power and the state of exception.
to biopolitics, the state managing life itself.
And ending with the camp, not as history, but as a potential paradigm for our present. It really highlights this inseparable link between power and life, often defined by who gets included and who gets excluded.
That act of inclusive exclusion seems to run through everything.
So if this is the path Western politics has taken, where, as Agamben puts it, all life becomes sacred in the sense of their life and all politics becomes the exception, the huge question he leaves us with is, can we imagine a totally different kind of politics?
One that isn't founded on excluding bare life, that doesn't rely on the exception.
What would that even look like?
And for you listening, what does it mean for your life right now if the underlying logic, the nomos of our world, is increasingly defined by these spaces, physical or legal, where the line between law and life, inclusion and exclusion, gets permanently blurred?
It's definitely something to think about long after this deep dive is over. How do we navigate a world potentially filled with these zones of exception?